السيدات والسادة، نرحب بكم مجددا ونبدأ معكم الجلسة الأولى لهذا اليوم بعنوان التعليم التضميني. يترأس الجلسة السيدة أنا لوسيا أريلانو، رئيس مؤسسة التحالف الدولي للاعاقه في نيويورك، ورئيسة شبكة أمريكا اللاتينية للمنظمات غير الحكومية للأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة وأسرهم، والناشطة في مجال حقوق الإنسان وحقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة. فلتتفضل مشكورة.
Good morning, Your Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ana Lucia Arellano. I am from Ecuador, Latin America, and I am here today representing the Global Disability Movement through a small representative organization, the International Disability Alliance, an alliance that represents a network of networks through 8 global and 6 regional organizations of persons with disabilities and their families. We are here today, united as a movement, advocating for the rights of persons with disabilities, passionate to shift from words to action, action for the people inside the room and for the more than 1 billion people with disabilities we represent. We are here today also to support our Arab regional member, the Arab Organization of Persons with Disabilities and Their Families, AOPD, mobilizing all efforts from different parts of the world to collaborate, to work jointly, and enrich our peer-to-peer collaboration, transforming advocacy as a real opportunity to make the real meaning of development, as that opportunity to make the change, that kind of change that improves the quality of life of persons with disabilities, with people with disabilities no more seen as beneficiaries, but as experts, real change makers. We are also here today to break down all those barriers that are stopping real inclusion to happen worldwide, especially those in our hearts and minds. Alhamdulillah, I take this opportunity also to congratulate Highness Sheikh Hamosa bin Nasser for all her efforts of ensuring that inclusive education really happens in Qatar, because by doing this, you are building the future in Qatar. I am delighted now to chair the Inclusive Education Panel, a fantastic opportunity to make a case on the most important pillars for the achievement of real inclusion. Inclusive education in the light of CRPD and SDGs, to not leave any child with disabilities behind, and ensuring quality inclusive employment. Y también estoy aquí como madre de José Miguel, un joven de 23 años, quien mientras yo estoy hablando con ustedes, él está trabajando para una aerolínea colombiana en Ecuador, el país en donde vivo, el país que le ha dado las oportunidades a mi hijo para experimentar la real educación inclusiva. Y él ahora está esperando esas oportunidades para poder tener ese título profesional, así como lo obtuvo mi primer hijo que acaba de graduarse como médico. La educación inclusiva es posible aún en los países subdesarrollados, si todos colaboramos y todos apostamos por trabajar juntos y sobre todo por consultar a las personas con discapacidad, para hacer realidad que nada de nosotros, sin nosotros, esté impreso en cada política pública, en cada decisión y en cada acción que realizamos. Now, I will be hearing from our panelists that I will invite to join me on stage. And I will start inviting Mrs. Maha Mohammed Al-Masuri, the CEO of Mara Assistive Technology Center of Qatar. Please join me on stage. I also invite Dr. Asa Abdel Molenum, Director of Family Research Department, Doha International Family Institute, Qatar. Welcome, Dr. Asa. And our final panelist is Ms. Salma El Kawad, the leader of the Resource Group of Self-Advocacy, Alexandria. Please join us on the panel. Ms. Salma. Take your time. We will be waiting for you. Thank you, Ms. Salma. And today, our keynote speaker is Mr. Ted Chalban, Regional Director of the Middle East and North Africa United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, from Jordan. Please, Mr. Ted, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start my speech today with an appreciation for Her Highness, the Government of Qatar, and the Qatar Foundation for Social Work for their leadership, hard work, and commitment to advance the work on disability in country and beyond, as well as for hosting such an important conference today. The Disability Rights Agenda is equally important for UNICEF, and we highly appreciate our partnership with the government of Qatar. As the DSG indicated in her opening remarks, just this month, the United Nations launched guidelines on disability, inclusion, and humanitarian context. The guidelines include a series of recommendations for humanitarian organizations in terms of recruiting more people with disabilities, including as frontline workers, partnering with organizations that represent people with disabilities, training humanitarians to recognize barriers and design inclusive programs, and collecting more data on disability to monitor equal access. This is a critical development in this humanitarian field coming at a crucial time. We hope that these guidelines will help humanitarian actors around the world to adopt a shared understanding of what disability-inclusive humanitarian action looks like. Moving on to inclusive education, including for children with disabilities. Hannah, she's 8, please see the picture up there, was injured by an exploding bomb in Aleppo, Syria. She now uses a wheelchair. She remembers, after being injured, not wanting to leave her home for months. Then, volunteers from a UNICEF-supported child-friendly space in Aleppo brought her to a center to play, sing, and draw. Hannah had dropped out of school for a year, but she got support and returned to continue her education. Her dream now is to become a physiotherapist to help children like herself. 10-year-old Danya, please see their picture, is everyone's favorite in class in Lebanon. Danya was born with Down syndrome. Her progress has accelerated tremendously since she went to school. She has learned to count, to recognize letters, and write keywords. Most important, her confidence has improved too. The biggest influence is her teacher, who says, inclusion for all my pupils is important, but it is especially vital for children such as Dania. Being at school is important for her, but it's also very beneficial for my other pupils. They've learned to see Dania as another classmate. Over time, they've come to value Dania for what she brings to the classroom. There are so many children out there, like Hana and Dania, who have dreams and aspire for a better future. They deserve and have the right to go to school, as do all other children. Disability of any kind is not a reason to be excluded from school, family, friends, or society. Inclusive education, and it needs to be inclusive, addresses the needs of all children, independent of who they are, where they are, or what they can do. All children, including children with disabilities, have the right to receive a quality education, to a supportive learning environment, and teachers who understand their needs, to reaching their full potential. World leaders, as we heard this morning, have responded to the call of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to provide equal opportunities for education for children with disabilities without discrimination. Many have adopted policies to make education systems more inclusive by collecting data, strengthening capacity of teachers and systems, increasing availability of assistive technologies, and addressing stigma and discrimination. If you allow, I'll switch for a few minutes to Arabic. بالنسبة لليونيسف فإن التعليم الشامل يعني أن يكون جميع الأطفال في الصفوف الدراسية نفسها وفي مدارس نفسها. الأنظمة الشاملة تقدر المساهمات الفريدة التي يقدمها كل طالب إلى الصف بشكل منفرد، وتسمح للمجموعات المتنوعة بأن تنمو معا جنبا إلى جنب بما يعود بالنفع على الجميع. تدعم اليونيسف البلدان لتقوية نظام التعليم الشامل من خلال التوعية بها ومناصرتها، ومن خلال بناء القدرات والدعم التنفيذ. نستطيع أن نجد أمثلة على التقدم المحرز نحو التعليم الشامل في جميع أنحاء العالم. ففي الأردن أصبحت المدارس والملاعب متاحة للأطفال ذوي الإعاقة، وفي مصر تضع الحكومة التعليم الشامل كواحدة من أولوياتها. يتلقى المعلمون التدريب على التعليم الشامل، ويتم إنشاء وتجهيز غرف مصادر لدعم تعليم الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة في المدارس الحكومية. وفي إيران تم مراجعة التشريعات الوطنية وأطر السياسات، ويجري الاستثمار لتعزيز قدرة المعلمين على تلبية احتياجات الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة في المدارس. Turning back to English and continuing to emphasize inclusive, integrated education. In Mongolia, Serbia, Vietnam, Tanzania, and many places around the world, inclusive education has become part of pre-service and in-service teacher training to support the steadily increasing numbers of children with disabilities in schools. Countries are collecting evidence for the design of inclusive education policies. In Indonesia, the National Household Survey includes a new set of disability questions, while Azerbaijan has conducted a study on knowledge, attitude, and practices around disabilities to inform policy. We have seen inclusive education implemented in a diverse range of countries, proving that it can be done in different income contexts and in humanitarian as well as in development settings. Low-income countries can do it, humanitarian settings can do it. Not only does inclusive education make moral sense, it also makes economic sense. Inclusive schools are more cost-effective and yield better lifetime social, academic, health, and economic outcomes for children with disabilities compared to segregated schools. And yet, despite all these important milestones, there still remains a lot to be done. reach remains limited. About half of all children with disabilities do not go to school because of prejudice, stigma, or lack of accessible learning opportunities. And some of those that do go to school are not receiving the quality education they have a right to, due to lack of trained teachers, accessible facilities, and learning tools. This is a waste of potential, not only for these children, but for their societies and economies, which will be denied their contributions, talents, and ideas. As a global community, we must face a difficult fact. We will not achieve SDG 4, education for all, if we continue failing children with disabilities. Not just getting them into school, but improving the quality of education they receive. Quality education for children with disabilities translate to quality education for all children. And we call, as the DSG, for the universal ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child with Disability globally, including here in the Middle East and North Africa. So what should we do to move forward? And I've got 4 points. Firstly, we need to make sure that children with disabilities are visible. We need to know who they are, where they live, what they need, and what barriers are keeping them from accessing the education they deserve. To inform this work, we have started collecting data on children with disabilities by developing a module on children with disabilities to include in the multiple indicator cluster surveys in countries like Algeria, Iraq, Tunisia, the state of Palestine, as well as dozens of countries in other regions, Pakistan, Mongolia, Montenegro, Sierra Leone, Lesotho, and others. We have also worked on a methodology to collect administrative data on children with disabilities in school through education management information systems. And we're looking at issues of barriers to education with children with disabilities and collecting that information to better understand why children are excluded from education. So that's the first priority. Secondly, having inclusive policies is not sufficient. We need to ensure that schools are prepared to receive children with disabilities. Schools need to be accessible in every way, from the environment to teaching to learning materials. Teachers need to be trained and supported to address the learning needs of each individual child. Support services must be available for children who need them. And the school community, parent-teacher associations, the environment in which the school is, needs to be committed to ensuring all children receive a quality education. Countries are piloting assistive devices. I think one of our panel members will speak to this. Namely, and the biggest progress has been around digital books to use in inclusive classrooms from Latin America to sub-Saharan Africa to this region. And they're taking measures to support the training of teachers in various countries. Third, this is the third recommendation on the way forward, we need together to fight stigma and discrimination against children with disabilities. I loved the motivational speaker who spoke about "don't diss my abilities." This will require concerted and sustained commitment at every level. We must recognize and respect the rights of children with disabilities and appreciate that they have just as much potential as anyone else. This is each of us our responsibility. What's important is that increasingly research has shown that inclusive education is not only good for children with disabilities, it is good for all children, for their development and their skills acquisition. Learning how to live, study, work with children and people across differences. A very important 21st century skill to master. Education is no longer just about reading, writing, and arithmetics. It is about soft skills. And soft skills is about working with each other across a range of abilities. As Her Highness says, we all have different abilities. Respecting diversity should be a common value for the future of the world and may even help us live in peace and with each other. And then last but not least, the fourth point. We need to engage with children with disabilities in the decisions that affect them, including to improve inclusive education, as Eddie reminded us. We can't leave any child behind. From the UNICEF perspective, I want to say very clearly that we remain committed to continue to support the disability rights agenda and to strengthen our work around the globe for the benefits of all children, working together with our committed partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted, for such a wonderful reflections about the importance of inclusive education. And I would like to give the floor to our panelists, and we will elaborate on your key issues about inclusive education. And I will first would like to start with Ms. Mohammed Al-Masuri. In talking about that having inclusive policies is not enough. We need to ensure that schools are prepared to receive children with disabilities. And I would like you to develop your speech and this reflection based on some keywords: innovation, access, empower, and equal opportunities. Please take the floor.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أشكر لكم الدعوة الكريمة، ويشرفني الوجود بين خبرات في مجال الشمولية لذوي الإعاقة وفي مجال إعداد السياسات. طبعا من منطلق حرصنا في أهداف التنمية المستدامة 2030 هو تحويل عالمنا، ولكن تحويل العالم لذوي الإعاقة وتمكينهم يحتاج أن ننظر إلى طبعا بناء نظام بيئي متكامل يهدف إلى التركيز على الشخص من ذوي الإعاقة، بحيث أن احنا نوفر جميع احتياجات هذا الشخص من ذوي الإعاقة في نظام التعليم بالذات. طبعا استوقفتني كلمة تعريف التعليم الشامل، والتعليم الشامل أن يكون جميع الطلاب في نفس الفصول الدراسية. واليوم احنا نراقب التغيرات الحاصلة في العالم ونستشرف المستقبل، ونرى أن العالم يتحول إلى العالم جميعا في التعليم العام ينظر إلى كيف أن احنا نطور الطالب في القرن ال21. لذلك العالم الآن أصبح قرية صغيرة، يجب الاستفادة من هذه الخبرة في تبادل الخبرات بين البلدان والمصادر المتاحة، بحيث أن احنا فعلا نعد الطلاب من ذوي الإعاقة لمرحلة 4.0 وهي الثورة الصناعية الرابعة، وذلك بتوفير التعليم الرقمي الشامل. لذلك أود أن أضيف أن التعليم الشامل يجب أن يكون جميع الطلاب ليس فقط في نفس الفصول الدراسية، ولكن في نفس المنصات الدراسية، وبالمنصات أقصد المنصات الرقمية. هناك نظام بيئي يجب الاعتداد به في إعداد التعليم الرقمي الشامل، والذي تستهدف بناء سياسات موجهة لدمج الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة في النموذج الرقمي. أيضا الابتكار والإبداع في مجال التكنولوجيا المساعدة، وهنا أخصص لغات التكنولوجيا المساعدة، لأن التكنولوجيا المساعدة بحد ذاتها قد تصلح لبعض البلدان، ولكن الناطقة بلغات أخرى يجب أن يتم هناك الاستثمار بحيث أن الطلاب يحصلون على نفس القدر من المساواة في الحصول على لغتهم الأولى في تعليمهم. أيضا هناك إعداد المعلمين القادرين على استخدام هذه التكنولوجيا المساعدة وتمكينهم من فعلا تقديم تعليم نوعي للأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة. أيضا تمكين الأهل، وذلك بأن يكون الأهل على وعي بحقوقهم وحقوق أبنائهم كمستفيدين من نظام التعليم. أيضا سياسات موجهة للتزويد بالتكنولوجيا المساعدة وأنها تكون متاحة من قبل الحكومات والمنظمات. أيضا النظام التعليمي وأنظمة الدعم لهذه الأنظمة. تم التحدث عن كيفية دمج الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة من الناحية الرقمية، وأنا أكرر على ذلك أن هناك يعني أمور أو principles لازم أن احنا ننظر إليها، وهي أن تكون هناك رؤية شاملة. يعاد النظر في رؤية التعليم في البلدان والحكومات، هل الرؤية تتضمن شمولية جميع الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة واحتياجات الطلاب، سواء الظاهرة منها أو المخفية من الإعاقات. القيود الوظيفية، وتمت مناقشة في المناقشة الأولى إذا كان هناك تعريف للإعاقة بالمستوى الطبي بالمستوى الوظيفي، وهنا في نظام التعليم أريد أن أطرح فكرة القيود الوظيفية وكيف نراعي القيود الوظيفية وتلبية احتياجاتها في رؤيتنا الشاملة. أن نعتمد أنظمة تصميم شاملة، هناك الأنظمة الشاملة للهندسية وهناك أيضا الأنظمة الشاملة للتعليم والذي يشار إليها بالuniversal design of learning، فيجب أن يتم تأكيد استخدام مثل هذه الأنظمة. أيضا التأكيد على وجود خبرة في التضمين في التصاميم للأنظمة التكنولوجيا، وأيضا في الشراء procurement policy سياسات الشراء. هل سياسات الشراء موائمة لما نبتغيه من شمولية الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة؟ هل هناك تضمين لآراء الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة وذويهم في مراجعة العقود قبل الشروع فيها؟ أيضا من ناحية استخدام التكنولوجيا والتكنولوجيا المساعدة، هل تم بناء قدرات والتدريب والدعم الفني للمدارس والأنظمة التعليمية؟ وأيضا يجب أن نحرص أن يكون هناك تطوير مستمر واستثمار في البحوث لإيجاد أفضل الحلول التكنولوجية الشاملة والاستفادة من الثورة الصناعية الرابعة في استخدام أحدث التكنولوجيات لتمكين الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة. الاستثمار في التكنولوجيا المساعدة هو يمكن حديث قائم بحد ذاته الآن. كيف ممكن أن احنا نستحدث تكنولوجيات تساعد الريجنال أو البلدان بحد ذاتها أو الريجن بشكل مختص. وبذلك يعني أريد أن أشير إلى نظام أو برنامج أو مبادرة في دولة قطر تسمى ببرنامج مدى للابتكار، الذي يسعى لتوفير حلول رقمية باللغة العربية للأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة. إلى يومنا الحالي لقد تم ابتكار 30 حل تكنولوجي متاح لجميع الدول الناطقة باللغة العربية للاستفادة منه في تعليم الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة. هناك بوابة متاحة للجميع للاطلاع عليها، وهي تسمى مدى AT بورتال، والتي تحتوي على جميع الأنظمة التكنولوجية التي تساعد الأشخاص من ذوي الإعاقة في إتمام تعليمهم أو توظيفهم أو حتى في حياتهم المجتمعية. مثل هذه المبادرة مطلوبة أن تكون في المناطق بحيث أنها هي تراعي خصوصية وثقافة الشعوب، وأيضا تؤمن حق الوصول للمعلومات باللغة التابعة للبلاد. أشكركم مرة أخرى، وهذا ما أردت المشاركة به.
Shukran, Mrs. Naha Mohammed Al-Masrouri. Thanks a lot for your key remarks. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Asa Abdelmoulenim. I'm sorry. I will ask you now if you can help us elaborate your reflections about how to fight stigma and discrimination against children with disabilities. Given that families have a key role in inclusive education, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad that I'm being invited for families, they have worldwide, they different characteristics. Each family has a different culture, have a different beliefs. And families, they may perceive needs differently and look at things differently. And it plays a big and important role in how we determine our priorities and how we use our resources. So if we look at the theoretical perspective of how the family looked at we look at the family, then we go into the child, then we go into the parents, and then we go into the siblings, and then how the role of the siblings plays an important role in defining the needs. The relationship between the siblings and each other determines also, plays also an important factor in determining the life of the child. Siblings, they learn critical social skills from each other. Such as sharing, such as negotiation, such as competition, all plays an important part in that. If we go then into a higher level from the parents and into the sibling, we go into the mesosystem, which is the peers, which is the school and the involvement, which needs to be also identification of the activities that allow for the meaningful participation of each child and a valid, unique cultural identity for each family. So the school also plays a very important role on that. And the community connection, which goes upper from that, from the mesosystem to the exosystem, which is the community connections, and how different approaches we need to develop it, and we have to involve it with the family. And there's been a lot of programs worldwide being implemented, and I think it's also, if correct me, Dr. Ted, if it's, I think also the FAST Families and Schools Together, this program, they've been implemented also by UNICEF to connect between the families and the community in after schools activities, and get into developing and making a collaboration and cooperation between the families and the schools, and which plays a very big important role. And then after that, we can go into a higher level, which is the macro system. And in the macro system, we need to understand what is the concept behind that, the diversity of the encompasses, which encompasses the inclusiveness and the respect for the disabled. And we have to also consider our cultural factors which exist and the immediate family environment. So this is in generally the theoretical perspective which I have always based. You can base your arguments, but I can understand there are other people who might have different opinions. But we can also look at what's the role of the family itself. The participation of the members of the family, the mother, the father, the grandfather, the siblings, the guardians, they all play an important role in the child personality. The parents, they know the best for their child. They know their likes, they know their dislikes, they know their strengths, they know their weaknesses. They know their desires, they know their needs, they know their abilities, their capacities, their challenges. All this, it's the parent who are responsible of. The parents, they are the ones who involve and they build a positive relationship. They encourage the new behaviors and they increase the self-satisfaction and optimism among themselves for their children and for their teachers. They help, they cooperate with the school authorities in making or providing the necessary arrangements and accommodation for this inclusive education. So it's the parents and the teachers who work together and their very best support for each other. But we still face challenges in us as parents or as families in having an inclusive education among Arab countries or worldwide. One of them, as you said, it's the stigma. And we have done recently, last year, a research on the well-being of families living with autism spectrum disorder here in Qatar, and where the stigma came as one of the indicators or one of the factors that hinders or is a main challenge for the families. The teacher-centered pedagogy, which is also a major challenge that hinders also inclusive education. We are still looking in Arab countries as a teacher-centered pedagogy and not as a learner-centered pedagogy, which is also one of the things that is hindering our educational perspective. The physical inaccessibility for the schools and the classroom, the negative attitudes that we get towards the the disabled child and how we look at it, how the environment is not being culturally accepting it. This is all our issues that we need to look at, which also faces and challenges the families for their children. The limited teachers as training and development, their independence, their skills, the playing skills, the physical and occupational therapists. We have lots of issues that families also here face in this region. The lack of parent involvement also, and it turned out in our studies that also the lack of the father, and it also can be the mother is the main person who is taking care of for the child. But the lack of the father, the disengagement of the fathers was also shown out in our report. The attitudes and the perceptions towards the disability with the special education was also a challenge, and the absence of the reliable data also from a research perspective was a challenge. So we need to look at things like that. We need to look at those challenges that face the families first, so that we can build up a bigger perspective, we can build up a bigger approach, and we can build our concerns around what's the family needs. We need to look at as Mr. Tetz looked, we need to bring out the disabled as a visible issue, and it's also been said. There's been a lot of practices, our best practices that I came across in the literature review, which is among them different frameworks that has been implemented. For example, the Family School Partnership Framework in Australia. There was also the WAVE model UK, an intervention also from the UK, and it's also been implemented by UNICEF in some countries in Uganda, if I'm correct. They're quite those best practices and frameworks. They did really play a role in terms of family school partnership framework, and where they looked at the child as the center, and where looked at key dimensions of communicating, connecting, learning, home at school, recognizing the role of the family, the consulting decision-making, the collaborating beyond the schools, and the participation between the family and the school and the community. So we need to have some kind of, I based some recommendations in terms of, in relation to what I have done. And we have to look at, for example, main issues or recommendations for the family, recommendations for the school, and then recommendations for the policymakers. For the family, we need to have an active interest for the child. You have to encourage your child. You have to visit always the school. You have to be part of the school. You have to raise concerns with the teachers. You have to show value for your education and value for your inclusive education. And you have to have higher expectations for your child. We still have the idea that children they're disabled, we have to keep them and we have to hide them in houses. We are not. We should bring them out. They are human beings. We're all, as it's been said earlier, we're all disabled somehow, somewhere. Recommendations for the school is that we need to also plan and support those families. We have to include education. We have to have planning. We have to have policies for mainstreaming children into our schools. We have to have availability of trained teachers, and we have to explore activities to promote the inclusion and to have to move from this teacher-centered approach into a more learners approach. For policymakers, we need to have a policy for mainstreaming, and also we have to have an equality policy for everybody, and accepts that every child has a unique capabilities. Unify the parties responsible for planning these processes and for the implementation and monitoring of inclusive education law, which is quite important and missing in our countries. We have to plan for the children with disabilities to start with a team discussion with the general education curriculum, and we should also look at the moving from a fragmentary process to a more
know that you love reading, you love photography and acting, that you are also learn sign language, and you are a teacher of child with disabilities. Now I would like to take the opportunity to ask you to help us identify how the nothing about us without us is possible in inclusive education. Please take the floor.
أشكركم على دعوتكم الكريمة لي في هذا المؤتمر الشيق الفعال. يتجه العالم حاليا إلى الاهتمام بالأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة، حيث أنهم يمثلون نسبة لا يستهان بها في أي مجتمع. وقد سعت منظمة الأمم المتحدة في هذا المجال وأصدرت الاتفاقية الدولية للأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة، وقد وقع عليها كثير من الدول العالم. وكذلك وضحت أهداف التنمية المستدامة، حيث يستفيد منها أعضاء المجتمع، وعلى وجه الخصوص الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة. ومن أهم من مواد الاتفاقية الدولية مادة التعليم، وكيف يجب دمج الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة في المدارس مع أقرانهم حتى ينشأ جميع الأطراف على التعايش الطبيعي مع بعضهم البعض مهما كانت اختلافاتهم. وبالرغم من جهود الدول في توفير القوانين والوسائل التعليمية المختلفة التي تكفل للأطفال وللأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة أن يتلقوا التعليم المناسب، إلا أن في الواقع ما زال هؤلاء الأطفال يعيشون التهميش في المدارس والتأخر في الالتحاق بالمدرسة، ويكونون أول من يطلقوا المدرسة، ونادرا ما يلحقوا بالتعليم الإعدادي أو الثانوي. وبالتالي لتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة للأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة فإننا نحتاج إلى إنجازات سياسية وبرامج وجهود من الدولة لهم قدرات كبيرة إذا ما تمت تنميتها وتطويرها على وجه الأمثل. فأنا اسمي سلمي الطباخ من مصر، ولدي متلازمة داون، وعمري 36 سنة. فمنذ الأسبوع الثاني من ولادتي أصر أبي وأمي أن أدمج في مجتمع الأسرة والمجتمع الخارجي ثم المدرسة، فاشتركوا كأعضاء داون سيندروم أسوسيشن في إنجلترا، الذي أمدتهم بالإرشادات والطرق المثالية لتربية طفل بمتلازمة داون، فكانت خير معين لهما. لقد نشأت في أسرتي تمام كأخي الأكبر وأختي الصغرى، فكنا نذهب إلى المتنزهات العامة والنوادي الخاصة، ونقوم بالسفر في الرحلات خارج مصر حتى اتسعت مداركي واكتسبت خبرات حياتية كثيرة نادرا ما يحصل عليها طفل بمتلازمة داون، حتى وصلت لسن الحضانة. فالتحقت بحضانة عادية مع أطفال عاديين، وتفاعلت معهم بشكل طبيعي بحكم السن الصغير، حتى وصلت لسن المدرسة. فأصر والدي أن ألتحق بمدرسة ابتدائية تابعة للتعليم العام في مصر. وفي هذا الوقت من الثمانينات القرن الماضي كان ذلك في منتهى الصعوبة، ولكني نجحت في الالتحاق بالمدرسة مع تفهم إدارة المدرسة وتدعيمها لي، وكانت أسرتي تمدني بالدعم والمساعدة. فكانت مدرسة الفصل في المدرسة هي التي تعطيني درس خصوصي في البيت، فأصبحت أحصل على نفس طريقة التعليم في المدرسة والبيت بجانب والدتي التي كانت تكرر معي ما تعلمته في المدرسة وفي الدرس الخصوصي، حتى أتممت المرحلة الابتدائية بنجاح وبدون تعثر في أي عام. ولكني كنت أواجه بعض المضايقات من باقي تلاميذ المدرسة الذين لا يألفون شكلي كأنني كائن غريب عنهم، فكانوا لا يلعبون معي وكنت تقريبا بمفردي في الفسحة. ثم التحقت بالمدرسة الإعدادية، وبنفس الطريقة مدرسة الفصل هي التي تعطيني الدروس الخصوصية في البيت، ثم تكرر معي أمي ما تعلمته في المدرسة من علوم ورياضيات وعربي وإنجليزي، حتى استطعت أجتاز هذه المرحلة بنجاح وبدون تعثر في أي عام. ولكنني استطعت في هذه السن أن أكون بعض الصداقات في المدرسة. ثم التحقت بالتعليم الثانوي القسم الأدبي، وبنفس الطريقة الدروس الخصوصية في البيت، حتى أحصل على تركيز المدرس التام لي. وحصلت على الثانوية العامة القسم الأدبي بمجموع يؤهلني للالتحاق بمعهد الخدمة الاجتماعية المتوسط، وحصلت على الدبلوم الخدمة الاجتماعية من جامعة الإسكندرية سنة 2002. أثناء الدراسة الثانوية وفي المعهد استطعت أن أكون صداقات، لأن زميلاتي أدركوا أني أتمتع بطبع مسالم وطيب، بالإضافة إلى الاجتهاد في التعليم. أما من لهم الفضل والشكر والعرفان فهم مدرسيني في جميع مراحل التعليم وأساتذتي في المعهد، حيث أنهم كانوا دائمي التعاطف معي ومساعدتي، وأدعو لهم دائما بالجزاء الطيب عند الله سبحانه وتعالى. ثم تطوعت في أكثر من جمعية خيرية لمدة 10 سنوات، لأنني كنت لا أستطيع إيجاد فرصة عمل، لأن أصحاب العمل عندما يرون ملامحي يرفضون قبولي بدون معرفة إمكانياتي وقدراتي. فانشغلت في الحصول على دورات عديدة في مجال الإعاقة السمعية والذهنية والتوحد. ثم حصلت على عمل في مركز تميز المتخصص في تنمية المهارات وتعديل السلوك للأطفال ذوي الاحتياجات الخاصة، وكان ذلك بسبب تفاهم واقتناع مدير المركز بقدراتي، وذلك عام 2014 وأعمل به حتى الآن. ثم عملت في مجال المناصرة الذاتية التي أثقلت شخصيتي وعلمتني كيف أدافع عن حقوقي وحقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة. وتم ترشيحي في منظمة الاحتواء الشامل كعضوة، واشتركت في مؤتمر المناصرة الذاتية في برمنغهام في إنجلترا عام 2018. ثم تم ترشيحي كممثلة لمنظمة الاحتواء الشامل لحضور تدريب بريدج عن الاتفاقية الدولية للأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة وأهداف التنمية المستدامة لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا في القاهرة من ديسمبر 2018 وأكتوبر 2019. وفي سبتمبر 2019 قمت بتدريب مناصرين ذاتيين من عدة دول عربية كلبنان والإمارات والأردن والكويت ومصر حول المناصرة الذاتية حول المناصرة الذاتية والاتفاقية الدولية لحقوق الأشخاص ذوي الإعاقة ضمن برنامج تمكيننا Empower Us بقيادة منظمة الاحتواء الشامل. إن منظمة الاحتواء الشامل بتسعى لتحقيق ذلك من خلال نقاط التحفيز للتعليم الدامج. 1. التعليم الدامج هو مفتاح الحياة الكاملة في المجتمع. 2. لا يمكن تحقيق التعليم للجميع بدون الأطفال ذوي الإعاقة. 3. لا يوجد طفل شديد الإعاقة لا يستطيع أن يدمج. 4. الحكومات تحتاج إلى دعم للتحويل إلى نظم الدمج. 5. التركيز على الدمج يؤدي إلى نوعية حياة جيدة للجميع. من كل ما سبق يتأكد لنا أنني ما كنت حصلت على هذه الإنجازات إلا بسبب دمجي في المجتمع وفي التعليم منذ الصغر، والتحدي الذي قمت به بمساعدة أسرتي من أجل الوصول إلى أهدافي، لأني أصبحت سلمى الطباخ بالفعل.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mrs. Salma. We are really delighted by hearing you. Thanks a lot, Salma, for raising your voice in behalf of all children, on behalf of all youths, on behalf of all adults with disabilities that are still waiting on inclusive education to happen. Thanks a lot, Salma. So now, I would like to give the floor to our keynote speaker, Mr. Ted Chapman, to finalize our panel with these final remarks based on the urgency to make children with disabilities visible and to work jointly to make inclusive education happen. Please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And I mean, frankly, what an impressive panel to be with. It's been truly inspiring to be here. And I would say I've retained several things. Firstly is a consensus around inclusive education. And I think Salma really, brought the point home about how important that is. In order to be inclusive, we, first and foremost need to know who is differently abled, where they are, and how to make sure they can be bought into the education system. And I think I'm heartened by the consensus around inclusive education on this panel, but also by the very practical way that different speakers have indicated it can be done even with relatively limited resources. I thought that the intervention from Maha, with her focus on assisted technology, but also the fact that it can be developed in context-specific way, and in this region in particular, in a way that's appropriate to culture and language. I thought that Azza's intervention really illustrated for me how inclusive education for differently abled children is in fact good education. And all she talked about, from the link between the family, the community, and the system, to the kind of support that's needed, it's what good education is. It's just that you need to go the extra mile for children that are differently abled, and work together to focus on that. And then I thought that Salma really put forward the importance of early learning, early intervention. I think later today in the conference there'll be a session on health, and how can the health system really address early detection of people's needs, different children's needs, and how they can be addressed early on so that they can be integrated into the system. So that interaction between the health system, the education, and as Hawa has said, the family and the community. And then lastly, I think all speakers implied, in some place spoke, I think quite explicitly, about the importance of not just integration, but of inclusion. I was very heartened by how Salma described when she first went to school. She had perhaps a hard time finding children who would play with her or would be her friends. But as she went through her education, she made friends. Because as she said, she's a good person who's there to try to achieve results and make a difference. And I think that's what we all are. We all are people who are trying to make a difference with our different abilities and our different capacities. So what I take away from this panel is that inclusive education is possible. It's possible in different contexts. It's possible if family, community, state, and systems get together and work to make a difference. And our panelists have illustrated that it can be done. Thank you.
So this panel has gone to its end, and I would like to thank our panelists and keynote speaker for your outstanding participation. I would like to also thank our rapporteur, Shaima. Thanks a lot for taking notes of the key remarks of our panel. And let's work all together to make an inclusive world for all, in every mountain, in every village, in every school, in every community, in every city, in every country, in every region, everywhere. Alhamdulillah, quality inclusive education is possible, is urgent, and is now. Shukran. Thanks a lot.
السيدات والسادة، الآن موعدنا مع استراحة الغداء، ونراكم بعد ساعة من الآن لاستكمال الجلسة الثانية هنا في مسرح المياسة. كما ننوه أن الجلسات المتبقية ستكون في غرف الاجتماعات.